There's a particular kind of Sunday night that people who were watching television between about 2011 and 2016 will remember. It wasn't every Sunday, just the ones from April through June, roughly, when a certain show was airing on HBO. You'd know it was one of those Sundays because by early evening there was already a low hum of anticipation about it. Not anxious exactly, just present. Something to look forward to in the way that not very many things in adult life actually give you something to look forward to anymore. The theme music would start, that clockwork mechanism unfolding across the map, cities rising from the ground, mechanisms turning, the camera pulling back over oceans and continents. Ramin Djawadi's main title playing, and even if you'd heard it 60 times, it still did something. It still felt like an event. And then for an hour, sometimes more, later on, you were somewhere else entirely. In a world that was brutal and beautiful in equal measure, where nobody was safe and nothing was guaranteed, and the story kept doing things that stories on television simply did not do, or hadn't up to that point. The show's visual identity was from the beginning genuinely cinematic in a way that television drama rarely achieved. Not just expensive looking, though it was that, but composed. The way the camera moved through spaces, the quality of the natural light they chose to film in, the unhurried patience with which certain sequences were allowed to develop. There were moments in the early seasons, particularly in the episodes set north of the Wall, where you might have been watching a feature film and not felt any significant difference. The ambition was always present, and the production, for most of the show's run, was equal to the ambition. Ramin Djawadi's score held everything together in a way that was easy to take for granted and becomes more obvious the further you get from the show. The theme, that clockwork mechanism of strings and percussion, was instantly recognizable within 2 seasons of the show's premiere, which is a remarkable thing for an original piece of television music. But beyond the main title, Djawadi built a whole architecture of recurring motifs, character themes, location themes, thematic themes. Light of the Seven, the piece that opens the season 6 finale, was written for harpsichord rather than the orchestral palette the show usually relied on. And the strangeness of that choice, the slightly unsettling precision of it, was absolutely right for the sequence it accompanied. That feeling is what this video is about, really. Not just the decline of Game of Thrones, though we will talk about that at length, in an unhurried and hopefully rather pleasant way. It's about what it felt like when the show was at its best, why it worked the way it worked, and how something that had spent years being genuinely extraordinary managed to end the way it ended. It's a long story, and I don't mean that in the sense that something went wrong quickly and then snowballed. I mean that understanding what happened to Game of Thrones requires understanding what it was before it became what it became. The rise and the fall are inseparable. The things that made the show extraordinary in its peak years contain the seeds of the problems that emerged later, which is, honestly, true of most things that collapse. The strength and the weakness are usually the same thing, just viewed from different angles. So we're going to take our time with this. Start at the beginning, with a show that almost didn't get made at all, work our way through the years when it was the biggest television programme on the planet, and then into the period when it wasn't quite anymore, and then very much wasn't. And somewhere in between we'll talk about George R.R. Martin and his unfinished books, and a pair of showrunners who had a date with a galaxy far, far away, and one of the strangest endings any major television series has ever produced. If you want to subscribe before we get into it, I'd appreciate it. It does genuinely help. But either way, let's start where all the best stories start, which is with everything nearly going wrong. The first thing to understand about Game of Thrones is that it came very close to not existing. Not in the every show faces obstacles sense that gets rolled out in every making of documentary. I mean in the more specific sense that the first attempt to make it was such a significant failure that it genuinely could have ended the whole enterprise before it started. George R.R. Martin published the first novel in his A Song of Ice and Fire series A Game of Thrones, in 1996. He was already a well-regarded writer by then, primarily known for his work in science fiction and horror, and he'd spent time in Hollywood, writing for television. He'd actually come back to prose, partly because he wanted to write something that couldn't be constrained by a TV budget. He wanted dragons and battles and a cast of thousands. He wanted the kind of sprawling, morally complicated medieval epic that would be, as he put it, essentially unfilmable. That word unfilmable is important because it shaped the entire negotiation about what kind of adaptation this would eventually become. Martin's concern wasn't that his books were too violent or too dark, it was that they were too big. A single chapter could cover events that would take millions of dollars to render on screen. A single battle could wipe out an entire production budget. The only format he could imagine doing justice to the story was a long-running television series with an unusually generous budget, which in 2007 was not exactly a common thing to offer a fantasy adaptation. The two men who acquired the rights to adapt the books were David Benioff, and HBO acquired the rights to adapt the books. Benioff was a novelist. He'd written The 25th Hour, which was adapted into a film directed by Spike Lee in 2002, and a novel called City of Thieves that remains quietly beloved by people who've read it. Weiss had written a novel that was never published. Neither of them had run a television show before. Neither of them had produced anything on the scale that adapting these books would require. The story of how they got the rights involves a meeting with Martin in which he apparently asked them a single question: who is Jon Snow's mother? The correct answer, or at least the answer that satisfied Martin, was Lyanna Stark. It was buried in the subtext of the first novel. Decades before the show would make it explicit. Benioff and Weiss got it right, and that was apparently enough. HBO said yes to a pilot in 2007. Filming happened in 2009, and then the pilot was screened for test audiences, and the results were, by most accounts, fairly catastrophic. The central problem was that viewers couldn't work out that Cersei and Jaime Lannister were siblings, which, given that their relationship is the inciting secret of the entire first novel, is a fairly significant issue. There were other problems too: pacing, tone, certain character dynamics that didn't land the way they were intended to. Around 90% of the material was scrapped and reshot. The actress playing Daenerys, Tamsin Merchant, was replaced by a 23-year-old called Emilia Clarke, who had done almost nothing on screen up to that point. The actress playing Catelyn Stark, Jennifer Eel, was replaced by Michelle Fairley. HBO greenlit the show anyway, or rather, greenlit a first season of 10 episodes based on the reshot material. The budget was somewhere between $5 and $6 million per episode, which for a cable drama in 2010 was substantial. Not enormous by the standards the show would later achieve, but enough to do the thing properly. Benioff and Weiss brought in Tim Van Patten to direct the opening 2 episodes, assembled a cast that was overwhelmingly British and Irish: Sean Bean as Ned Stark, Peter Dinklage as Tyrion, Lena Headey as Cersei, Nikolai Coster-Waldau as Jaime, and set about making television that looked like cinema. The premiere, Winter is Coming, aired on April 17, 2011. It drew 2.22 million viewers in the United States, which was, at the time, perfectly respectable for a new HBO drama. Not a blockbuster, not a phenomenon, just a show that had arrived and seemed like it might be worth watching. Nobody in April 2011 had any reason to believe that this would eventually become the most watched drama in the history of the network, but that's how it always starts, quietly. HBO was actually somewhat cautious about the first season. The original order was 6 episodes, not 10. 10 episodes to establish a world with dozens of named characters, multiple competing political factions, 3 geographically separate storylines, and a supernatural threat that wouldn't come properly into focus for years. That's a tight brief by any measure. The discipline that imposed on the storytelling was probably an advantage. You can't afford to be slow when you have 6 hours to make people care about something. The production itself was split across multiple countries from very early on. Northern Ireland for the cold north, Castle Ward doubling as Winterfell, the Ballantoy Harbour standing in for the Iron Islands, Malta for the warmer southern material in Season 1. The logistical ambition of filming in so many different locations simultaneously was significant, and it established a visual richness that the show never abandoned, even as the specific locations shifted over the seasons. By Season 2, Dubrovnik in Croatia had become King's Landing, and that association, the limestone walls, the sea, the compressed medieval architecture, became so strong that people still visit Dubrovnik specifically because of the show. The tourism impact on the city became measurable within a couple of seasons. The casting choices, looking back, were remarkably sound. Sean Bean as Ned Stark is the obvious one, a British actor known primarily from action films and period dramas, who brought a worn decency to the role that made his inevitable death feel like a genuine loss, rather than a plot convenience. Peter Dinklage as Tyrion Lannister was, by many accounts, non-negotiable for Martin. He strongly pushed for Dinklage in the role once the show was underway. Lena Headey, Nikolai Coster-Waldau, Charles Dance as Tywin in later seasons. Maisie Williams cast at 14 years old to play Arya. The show's talent for finding actors who understood what the material was asking of them was one of its most consistent qualities all the way through. The irony of the whole troubled pilot situation is that the recast and reconstruction that felt like a near disaster at the time probably improved the show. The versions we saw, Clark's Daenerys, Fairley's Catelyn, are hard to imagine being surpassed. Sometimes, the near collapse turns out to be the necessary shakeout before something works properly. The question of why Game of Thrones worked the way it worked in its first several seasons is actually more interesting than it might seem, because the answer isn't simply it was well made. Plenty of well-made shows don't become cultural phenomena. The answer has more to do with the specific set of structural advantages that the show had during its best years. Advantages that were, it turned out, finite. The most important of those advantages was the source material itself. Martin had been writing A Song of Ice and Fire since 1991. By the time the show premiered, he'd published 5 novels, just under 4,000 pages of dense, meticulously constructed political intrigue, character psychology, and world building. What that meant in practice was that Benioff and Weiss weren't inventing the story. They were translating it, and that's a fundamentally different creative challenge. When you're adapting existing material, you're making thousands of decisions about what to keep, what to compress, what to lose. But the characters' motivations are already established. The internal logic of the world is already worked out. The foreshadowing is already embedded in the text. Martin had spent 15 years making sure that everything connected. When the show lifted material from the books, it was lifting a finished architecture. The bones were sound because someone had already stress-tested them. The second structural advantage was the writing room itself, especially in the early seasons. Benioff and Weiss didn't write the show alone. Brian Cogman, who joined as a script coordinator and worked his way up to staff writer, wrote some of the best episodes across the first 6 seasons. Vanessa Taylor contributed to seasons 2 and 3, and George R.R. Martin himself wrote 1 episode per season for the first 4 years. Not the biggest episodes necessarily, but episodes that tended to carry an unusual weight, because Martin was writing dialogue for characters he'd lived with for 2 decades. The third advantage, and this is the one that was most visible to viewers, even if they couldn't articulate it, was that the show had established a genuine covenant with its audience about consequences. Ned Stark dies in episode 9 of season 1. The main character, the moral centre, the person, the entire first season has been structured around, executed on the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor on the orders of a petulant teenage king, while his daughter watches from the royal platform. There's no last-minute rescue. There's no dramatic reversal. He's just gone. I remember watching that episode for the first time, and the specific feeling of the floor dropping out from under the narrative. Not horror exactly, more like the realization that this show was operating by different rules. In most television, main characters don't die like that. They get rescue arcs, or they sacrifice themselves heroically, or they're written out in ways that feel managed. Ned Stark got his head cut off because he was honest in a world that punished honesty, and the show just let that be what it was. That moment and the Red Wedding 2 seasons later, which we'll get to, established the show's central promise to its audience. What happens in this story will have consequences that stick. Nobody is protected by narrative convention. Nobody survives on the basis of being important to the plot. And that promise was what gave every dangerous scene its genuine tension. When characters were in peril, you believed the peril was real, because the show had demonstrated repeatedly that it was. The fourth thing, slightly harder to quantify, was the ensemble cast approach. Most long-running dramas have a clear protagonist: the detective, the doctor, the lawyer around whom everything orbits. Game of Thrones distributed its point of view across 15, 20, sometimes more characters simultaneously. That was challenging to keep track of, but it was also liberating. It meant the show could kill anyone. It meant no single character's survival was structurally guaranteed by their narrative centrality. And underneath all of this, holding it together in a way that's easy to underestimate, was Ramin Djawadi's score. The main title theme became one of the most recognizable pieces of music in television history. Not because it was flashy, but because it was structural. The opening credits weren't just a title sequence. They were a geography lesson and a tone-setting device. The music established the show's emotional register before a single line of dialogue had been spoken. All of these things worked together. The source material providing depth, the writing room providing craft, the no sacred cows approach providing genuine stakes, the ensemble providing breadth, and the score providing an emotional through-line. Remove any one of those elements, and the show would have been good, but probably not transformative. What made it transformative was having all 5 at once. The 4 seasons from 2011 to 2014 represent what most people, when they talk about Game of Thrones, mean when they say the show was good. There's general agreement on this even among people who disagree about almost everything else regarding the series. The first 4 seasons were operating at a consistent level of quality that, for a show of this scale and ambition, was genuinely remarkable. Season 1 is almost entirely set up, and it remains a fascinating piece of television because of the structural audacity of what it does with Ned Stark. The whole season is built around Sean Bean, his moral code, his political naivety, his love for his children. He's the audience surrogate. He's who you follow. And then the show executes him, and you are left in a world that suddenly has no centre. What do you do with your trust when the person you trusted most is gone? That question, who do you follow now, is what carries you into Season 2, which is structurally the most complicated season the show produced. The War of the Five Kings fractures the story across half a dozen simultaneous threads, and the show manages the balance well enough that the complexity feels like richness rather than chaos. The Blackwater episode is the highlight, a 54-minute sustained siege sequence set almost entirely at one location that Benioff and Weiss petitioned HBO for an extra $2 million to produce. HBO said yes. You can see where the money went. Season 3 is where the show became a cultural event in a way that it simply hadn't been before. The Red Wedding is in Season 3, Episode 9, The Rains of Castamere. Robb Stark, who has spent 2 seasons being the North's best hope, who has never lost a battle, who married for love against all political advice and paid for it with the fragile alliance that kept him safe, arrives at the Twins for his uncle's wedding. And over the course of a single scene, Robb, his wife Talisa, his mother Catelyn, and most of his army are betrayed and slaughtered by the Boltons and the Freys. The reaction videos from that night are still remarkable to watch. People screaming at their televisions, people turning to their companions in genuine open-mouthed disbelief. viewers who had read the books and knew what was coming, watching the faces of viewers who hadn't. The Red Wedding became, almost immediately, one of the defining TV moments of the decade. Not just a shocking scene, a specific kind of storytelling that felt like it shouldn't be possible on television, and yet, there it was. Season 3 averaged 4.97 million live viewers, with cross-platform numbers around 14.4 million, up significantly from Season 2's already healthy numbers. Season 4 is, by the metrics, the best season the show produced. IMDb average of around 9.45, the highest of any of the 8 seasons. Joffrey's poisoning at his own wedding. Tyrion's trial for a murder he didn't commit. Peter Dinklage's monologue in the courtroom scene, "I wish I was the monster you think I am," delivered with a controlled fury that won him his 4th Emmy nomination. Oberyn Martell's duel with the Mountain, which ends in one of the most viscerally horrifying single shots the show ever staged. Oberyn Martell deserves more than a passing mention, actually, because he's one of the clearest examples of the show's talent in its middle seasons for introducing new characters and making the audience care about them deeply in very short order. Pedro Pascal played him, Pascal, who would later become one of the biggest stars in entertainment through The Mandalorian and The Last of Us, but who most people first encountered as this particular Dornish prince. Oberyn arrives in Season 4 with an agenda. He wants justice for the murder of his sister, Elia Martell, during the sack of King's Landing, and over the course of a single season, he becomes one of the most fully alive presences the show produced. His trial by combat against the Mountain is constructed with meticulous tension. Oberyn fighting not just to save Tyrion, but to avenge his sister, and making the mistake, at the moment of apparent victory, of needing the Mountain to confess before he dies. That pause, that one moment of needing something more than just the killing. The show understood and exploited how that kind of very human desire for acknowledgement, for the satisfaction of being seen to be right, can be the thing that destroys you. It's brutal and it's honest, and it resonates the way genuinely true things do. Season 4 averaged 6.84 million live viewers. Cross-platform, closer to 19 million. The show was now, unambiguously, the biggest scripted series on cable television, and it was still getting bigger. Season 4 also had one of the most structurally unusual episodes the show produced, The Laws of Gods and Men, in which the entire middle section of the episode is given over to Tyrion's trial. A chamber drama, essentially. A long dialogue scene in which Tyrion is expected to perform his innocence for a court that has already decided he's guilty. And Peter Dinklage, who had been quietly excellent for 3 seasons, often in scenes where the writing gave him the most to work with, delivered a performance in the final section of that episode that was, for my money, the single best individual acting moment in the show's run. I wish I was the monster you think I am. The camera barely moves. He just talks, and every line of what he says is the accumulated weight of the show's entire portrait of this character. The small man who survived by being the cleverest person in any room, who protected himself with wit because he had nothing else to protect himself with, who had watched his family use him and discard him and blame him for things he didn't do, finally saying clearly and with terrifying control exactly what he thinks of all of it. The speech earned Dinklage an Emmy nomination. It deserved to. Across seasons 3 and 4, the show was also developing the character who would eventually become, arguably, its most beloved, Jaime Lannister. At the end of season 1, Jaime was essentially a villain, handsome, arrogant, the man who killed the previous king, giving him his unofficial title, the Kingslayer. The man sleeping with his sister. He was designed to be disliked. And then across seasons 3 and 4, the show dismantled that design piece by piece. His journey with Brienne of Tarth across the hostile Riverlands, his captured and tortured, his hand is cut off, which for a man whose entire identity was built around being the finest sword in Westeros is a devastating loss. And in the space of losing his hand, in the conversations he has with Brienne while recovering from it, Jaime Lannister becomes one of the most complex characters in the entire story. The reveal of why he killed the Mad King, not from treachery, not from opportunism, but to save the 500,000 people of King's Landing from being burned alive by a man who had descended into genuine madness, recontextualizes everything you thought you knew about him. It's a piece of retroactive world building that deepens the whole story. The show could do that in the early seasons. It could take a character you thought you understood and reveal, with a single, quiet conversation, that you'd been reading them entirely wrong. That kind of complexity requires patience, and it requires an audience that's paying close enough attention to feel the shift. Both things were present. The show trusted its viewers, and its viewers repaid that trust by caring enormously. What these 4 seasons share, the thing that connects them, that makes them feel like a coherent body of work, is a quality that I'd describe as earned weight. Things that happen carry the weight of everything that preceded them. Ned Stark's death means something because we spent 9 episodes understanding who he was. The Red Wedding lands the way it does because we've watched Robb make every wrong political decision for 2 seasons and understood why he made each one. Joffrey's death means something because we've watched him be monstrous for 3 seasons and felt with each episode a little more of the show's characteristic dark patience, the sense that this story is playing a long game and that the long game will eventually resolve. That quality, earned weight, is not a thing you can manufacture cheaply. It requires time and patience and a consistent creative vision. All 3 of those things were present in the first 4 seasons. What happened to them later is most of what this video is about. A related quality, one that often gets overlooked in discussions of the show's craft, was its relationship to information. Game of Thrones was unusually generous in trusting its audience to keep up. Most television dramas, particularly in that era, would have included expository dialogue to help viewers track the political situation. Conversations that exist solely to let characters explain to each other things they already know, for the benefit of people watching at home. The show did this as little as it could get away with. Characters spoke to each other like people who shared context, not like people performing for an audience. You were expected to do some of the work yourself. That expectation was part of the covenant the show made with its viewers. It was saying, "We think you're smart enough to follow this without being walked through it." And audiences, as it turns out, respond positively to being respected in that way. The show's complexity wasn't a bug, it was a feature. The density of the world, the fact that there was always more to know, more history to discover, more connections to find, made it rewarding to pay attention. The direwolves deserve a mention, actually, because they represent something quite specific about the show's approach to symbolism. Each of the Stark children has a direwolf: Ghost for Jon, Lady for Sansa, Nymeria for Arya, and so on. The wolves function throughout the first several seasons as extensions of their owners' character arcs, living indicators of each Stark's relationship to their own nature and to the world they inhabit. Sansa's wolf is killed early. Robb's wolf dies with him at the Red Wedding. Ghost survives with Jon through everything. It's not subtle symbolism, but it's sustained. And sustained symbolism, even obvious sustained symbolism, does its work on you over time. The show was also, particularly in the middle seasons, genuinely funny in a way that doesn't always get acknowledged. Tyrion and Bronn's road trip dynamic. Davos Seaworth slowly improving literacy. The recurring comedy of Samwell Tarly being spectacularly ill-suited to every situation the Night's Watch placed him in. The wit in the writing, especially in dialogue scenes between characters with an established adversarial dynamic, was real. It kept the darkness from being relentless, and it made the characters more fully human than they might have been if the show had played everything at the same grave register. By season 5, Game of Thrones had become something that most television shows never become: a genuine global cultural phenomenon. Not just popular, not just critically acclaimed, a thing that people who didn't normally watch television were watching, and that people who didn't normally discuss television were discussing, and that turned up in political speeches and academic papers and the names parents gave their children. Khaleesi, as a baby name, peaked in 2018, which tells you something about both the show's cultural reach and possibly certain parents' relationship with spoilers. Season 5 aired in 2015, and HBO had by that point declared it their most watched series ever, overtaking The Sopranos, which had held that position for over a decade. The Season 5 premiere was simultaneously broadcast in 173 countries, making it the largest TV drama simulcast in history. Guinness World Records confirmed the Season 5's second episode simulcast record. The show was also, during this period, the most pirated television program in the world. Which sounds like a problem, but HBO's attitude toward the piracy was characteristically unbothered. The theory being that a show people cared enough about to pirate was a show that was doing something right. The writing was still strong in Season 5, though there were early signs of strain in places. One episode, Unbowed, Unbent, Unbroken, received a 54% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, making it the only episode up to that point to be classified as rotten. The handling of certain storylines, particularly around Sansa, drew genuine and substantive criticism. The show was still largely working from Martin's source material, but it was starting to make more significant divergences, and some of those divergences were less successful than others. Season 6, though, is where the show reached something like its commercial and technical peak simultaneously. The episode budget jumped to $10 million per episode, up from about $6 million just a season or two earlier. And Miguel Sapochnik, a director who had joined the show in Season 5, produced what remains some of the most technically accomplished television ever made. Battle of the Bastards, Season 6, Episode 9, is the battle sequence that Game of Thrones had been building toward for years. Jon Snow and his allied forces taking on Ramsay Bolton's army outside Winterfell. Sapochnik and his team spent weeks choreographing the sequence. The cavalry charge alone, the moment when Ramsay's horsemen encircle Jon's infantry in a closing ring of steel, is a piece of staging that most feature films don't achieve. The episode won the Emmy for Outstanding Directing for a Drama Series. The Winds of Winter, the Season 6 finale, is, for my money, the single best directed episode the show produced. The opening sequence, set in King's Landing on the morning of Cersei's trial, runs almost entirely without dialogue for its first 15 minutes. Light of the Seven plays. Cersei dresses alone in her rooms. Her enemies gather in the great sept of Baelor, and then methodically and mercilessly she blows it up. Wildfire beneath the sept, green fire consuming stone, the entire political opposition to Cersei Lannister eliminated in a single, elegant act of premeditated mass murder. It's extraordinary television. Season 6 averaged 7.69 million live viewers in the US. Cross-platform, around 25.7 million. Season 6 had a 94% tomato meter score on Rotten Tomatoes. The critics were at 94%. These were the numbers of a show that had managed something almost unprecedented in television. It had grown its audience every single season for 6 years. From 2.2 million viewers for the Season 1 premiere to numbers that were, genuinely, making the broadcast networks nervous. The cultural reach during this period is worth dwelling on, because it's the context for understanding just how significant the later decline was. Game of Thrones wasn't just a popular show, it was the kind of cultural touchstone that appears once in a generation, the thing that people reference in conversations about entirely unrelated topics, that shapes the language people use, that produces genuine, emotional responses in strangers who discover you also watch it. The Iron Throne had become one of the most recognised visual symbols in popular culture. Ramin Djawadi's theme music could be heard in ringtones, in sports broadcasts, in shopping centres. Politicians in multiple countries used the show's imagery in campaign materials. Academic journals published papers analysing its political philosophy. International relations scholars cited it in discussions of Machiavellian statecraft. Species were named after characters. A de-extinction project working on bringing back dire wolves cited the show as a cultural reference point for why the animal mattered to people. The awards story during this period tells its own version of events. Game of Thrones won the Emmy for Outstanding Drama Series in 2015, 2016, 2018 and 2019, 4 wins in total, tying the record for any drama series. In 2015 alone, the show won 12 Emmys across the primetime and creative arts ceremonies, setting a record for most wins by a drama series in a single year. The Visual Effects Society awarded it 29 times across its run, the all-time record for any television series. The show collected 272 awards from 757 nominations across all the major ceremonies. What makes those numbers interesting is the timing. The peak of the award recognition, 2015-2016, corresponds almost exactly with the show's commercial and creative peak. The Emmy for Outstanding Drama in 2019, for the final season, was awarded on the basis of the season receiving 32 nominations, a record for any single season of a scripted show. The Academy was honouring a show that its own audience had given a 30% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. The gap between critical industry recognition and audience satisfaction in that final year was, to put it mildly, notable. Season 6 also introduced what I'd argue is the show's single greatest creative hire, Miguel Sapochnik, who had joined in Season 5 for Hardhome and returned to direct Battle of the Bastards and The Winds of Winter in Season 6. Sapochnik's visual sensibility, the way he composed action sequences, the particular quality of chaos he could create while maintaining spatial coherence, elevated the show's production values into territory that genuinely competed with theatrical cinema. His work in Season 6 won him the Emmy for directing. He would later become a co-showrunner on House of the Dragon, which tells you something about what the franchise thought of him. And right around here, in the late summer of 2016, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way the audience would have noticed immediately. But looking back, the Season 6 finale is the last time everything was working at once, the show at full capacity. What it was about to lose and how is where the story gets more complicated. There's a sentence in the production notes for Game of Thrones that becomes more significant the longer you sit with it. It appears in various forms, in multiple interviews and retrospectives, and it goes roughly like this. The series outpaced its source material after Season 5, with Benioff and Weiss working from George R.R. Martin's outlines for the remaining story. On the surface, that sounds fairly technical. In practice, it was a fundamental change in what the show was and how it worked. George R.R. Martin published the 5th novel in his series A Dance with Dragons in 2011, the same year Game of Thrones premiered on HBO. The next book, The Winds of Winter, was anticipated within a year or two. Martin himself suggested timelines, repeatedly. Those timelines came and went. The book that was supposed to guide the show's final seasons simply does not exist yet. What this meant for Benioff and Weiss was that after Season 5 they were essentially flying without instruments. Martin had provided outlines, broad strokes of where major characters ended up, some of the larger plot beats, but outlines are not the same as finished prose. As discussed earlier, the novels weren't just the plot, they were the interiority, the characters' internal logic, the decades of careful preparation behind every story choice. Without that, Benioff and Weiss had to reverse engineer motivations from the outside. They knew where people ended up. They didn't always have a clear account of why those people would credibly get there. And that gap between destination and journey is what the audience would eventually notice most painfully in Season 8. There's also the question of who was doing the writing. In the early seasons, the show had a genuine writer's room. Brian Cogman, Vanessa Taylor, Martin himself. Multiple voices shaping the material. By seasons 7 and 8, that room had contracted significantly. Benioff and Weiss were writing or co-writing the majority of episodes. The single voice problem, what happens when any creative work becomes dependent on too few perspectives, was setting in. The Star Wars context matters here, because it's relevant to what follows. In February 2018, while Game of Thrones was still in production on its final season, it was announced that Benioff and Weiss had been hired by Lucasfilm to develop a new Star Wars film trilogy. The announcement was made publicly, while they were simultaneously responsible for finishing one of the most anticipated conclusions in television history. Sources reported across multiple outlets, including No Film School and The Hollywood Reporter, suggested that HBO had been willing to give Benioff and Weiss more episodes for the final act of the show, that the network's position was essentially, take what you need, do it properly, and that Benioff and Weiss by that point wanted to be done. They had spent 8 years in Westeros. They had, by their own admission, in various interviews, found the final seasons creatively exhausting. They were looking ahead. None of that is a crime. 8 years is a long time to live inside any creative project, and creative exhaustion is real. But the audience at home didn't know any of this. They were just watching the show they loved, waiting for what they'd been promised would be a worthy conclusion. The fact that the people responsible for providing that conclusion had, to varying degrees, already mentally moved on, that was information that only became apparent in retrospect. There's a structural issue here that goes beyond just Benioff and Weiss's personal trajectory, and it has to do with what happens to any long-running creative project when its conditions change. The first few seasons of Game of Thrones were made under a particular kind of productive pressure. The pressure of a show that was still proving itself, that had to earn its audience week by week, that couldn't rely on accumulated goodwill to carry it through a weak episode. That pressure creates a specific kind of creative alertness. You're paying attention because you have to. By season 7 and 8, those conditions had changed completely. The show was too big to fail commercially. The audience was coming back regardless of episode quality. As the season 8 numbers demonstrated, 12 million people were watching even when the critical reception was the worst in the show's history. The urgency that had sharpened the early work was gone, replaced by something more like institutional momentum. The show was finishing because it was finishing, not because it was fighting. That shift from hunger to maintenance is something you can feel in the texture of the later seasons if you watch them back to back with the earlier ones. The early seasons feel like they're trying to do something. The later ones feel like they're trying to get somewhere. Both are forms of forward motion, but they're fundamentally different experiences. Season 7 is the season that people argue about most in a way. Not because it produced the show's most controversial moments. Season 8 takes that distinction fairly decisively, but because it's the hinge. The season where you can see the transition happening in real time if you're watching for it. Where what had been a few small cracks in the foundation becomes something you can't quite ignore anymore. The most immediately visible change was structural. Seasons 1 through 6 ran 10 episodes each. Season 7 ran 7. Season 8 would run 6. The final 13 episodes of Game of Thrones compressed a story that, by any reasonable accounting, had enough material for at least 20 or 22. That compression was a creative choice, Benioff and Weiss's choice, and it had consequences at every level. The premiere was also pushed to July, shifted from the traditional spring slot to accommodate production and weather requirements. This created a nearly 13-month gap between season 6 and season 7, the longest the show had gone between seasons up to that point. Which is fine, normally, but it meant that when season 7 arrived, the expectations attached to it were enormous, and the season had fewer episodes with which to meet them. The fan discourse around season 7 coalesced pretty quickly around a single word: teleportation. Characters were moving across the continent at speeds that made no geographical sense. Euron Greyjoy would be in King's Landing in one scene and intercepting a fleet somewhere near Essos in the next, with no apparent acknowledgement that the distance involved would take weeks to travel. The wildling expedition Beyond the Wall in Episode 6, Beyond the Wall, involves sending a raven from north of the wall to Dragonstone, Daenerys receiving it, and then flying 3 dragons to the wall in what the episode implies is a matter of hours. The show had always compressed geography. It would have been unwatchable if it hadn't, given how spread across the world its characters were. But there's a difference between narrative compression that you agree to overlook and narrative compression that the show is visibly embarrassed by. Season 7 tipped from the former into the latter in a few too many places. More significantly, the handling of certain characters started to feel off in ways that were harder to explain. Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, the scheming political operator who'd been one of the show's genuinely fascinating villains for 6 years, spent most of Season 7 lurking around Winterfell, doing very little, and then was unmasked and executed by the Stark siblings in the finale. The execution was satisfying enough in a bad person getting what they deserved sense, but the path to it involved Baelish being visibly outmaneuvered by people who shouldn't have been able to outmaneuver him, making decisions that his 6-year characterization as the smartest political mind in Westeros didn't support. It felt less like a character arc and more like a conclusion that needed to happen before Season 8, so it was made to happen. And here's the thing about Season 7 that I find most interesting in retrospect. The numbers were still enormous. 26 million average live viewers, cross-platform closer to 33 million, the highest rated season in the show's US broadcast history up to that point. The audience hadn't gone anywhere, and the IMDb average for Season 7 was still around 9.27, on par with the first 3 seasons. But the audience score on Rotten Tomatoes had dropped to 80%, down from the mid-90s of previous seasons. Not catastrophic, but a meaningful shift. The critical community was still largely positive. Season 7 sits at 93% on Rotten Tomatoes' critic score, but there was a growing gap between the professional consensus and what the general audience was experiencing, and the two groups were increasingly watching different versions of the same show. What Season 7 was, fundamentally, was a transition season that the show didn't quite have the time to do properly. It had to move characters into position for the final 6 episodes, resolve storylines that had been building for years, and begin the closing chapters of the story's 3 primary threads: the White Walker threat, the Lannister-Targaryen conflict, and Jon Snow's true identity. It did most of this adequately, some of it quite well. None of it felt quite like the show at its best, and that was fine as far as it went. Not every season can be Season 4. The question was whether the show had enough runway left to finish well. 7 episodes is a very short runway. One thing Season 7 did very well was the political dynamic between Daenerys and Tyrion. The scenes in the war room at Dragonstone, where Tyrion repeatedly argued for restraint and Daenerys repeatedly pushed for the use of her dragons as a direct weapon, captured something interesting about the tension between idealism and pragmatism that the show had always been good at. Daenerys wanted to win quickly and decisively. Tyrion wanted to win in a way that left something worth governing afterward. That argument between the person with power and the person whose job is to explain why power should be used carefully is one of the oldest and most honest arguments in political history, and the show rendered it with real texture. The Cersei storyline in Season 7 is also, I think, underrated. Lena Headey's performance throughout the season, playing a woman who has burned everything to get what she wanted, and is now holding it with both hands, while everything around her burns further, is precise and controlled in ways that are easy to take for granted. Cersei in Season 7 is planning ahead, making contingencies, surviving. The scene in which she reveals her pregnancy to Jaime is a scene that means entirely different things, if you believe her and if you don't, and Headey plays it in a way that makes both readings viable simultaneously. The Dragon Pit Summit, the Season 7 finale's gathering of representatives from all the major surviving factions in a ruined arena in King's Landing, is a piece of staging that most shows would have been thrilled to produce. The logistics of getting all these characters into the same space, after 7 seasons of separation, and making that gathering feel earned rather than contrived, is a real achievement. The moment when a White is released and scrambles towards Cersei, and her face cycles through surprise and terror and calculation in about 3 seconds, is a reminder of what Hedy was capable of when the material gave her something specific to play. Season 7 had moments like that scattered throughout, enough to make it worth watching, not quite enough to make it the show it had been. Let me just say, before we get into this, that I have tried to approach Season 8 with genuine fairness. I know that's not how it usually goes. The discourse around the final season became so heated, so quickly, that it's difficult to talk about it without either defending it in a way that feels contrarian or dismissing it in a way that feels like pile-on. I'm going to try to do neither. Just walk through what happened, why it didn't work the way it didn't work, and what the numbers said afterward. The Season 8 premiere aired on April 14th, 2019. 11.76 million live viewers. The budget per episode was $15 million, making it, at that time, the most expensive television ever produced. The 20-month gap since the Season 7 finale had been the longest between seasons in the show's history. The anticipation was, if anything, even larger than usual. The audience had been patient. They were ready. The season had 6 episodes to resolve. The White Walker threat, the war with Cersei, Jon's true parentage, and what it meant politically, Daenerys' arc, and the question of who ends up on the Iron Throne. 6 episodes for a story that, in the source material, was expected to take at least 2 more substantial novels to tell. The first 2 episodes are, by most accounts, the strongest of the season, slower, more character-focused, doing the emotional groundwork for what follows. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, the second episode, is written by Brian Cogman and is widely regarded as one of the gentler and more affecting hours of the final run. Characters gathering around a fire the night before the battle, aware that many of them won't survive it. Jaime knighting Brienne of Tarth, the sense, briefly, that the show still knew how to be quiet. And then Episode 3, The Long Night, the Battle of Winterfell. 55 consecutive nights of filming in freezing conditions in Northern Ireland. A technical achievement of staggering ambition, thousands of extras, complex stunt choreography, VFX sequences that required over 2 years of post-production work. Miguel Sapochnik directed it, the same director who had made Battle of the Bastards extraordinary. And the overwhelming response to it from a large proportion of the audience was, I couldn't see a thing. The episode was filmed with a deliberately dark visual palette. The cinematographer, Fabian Wagner, later explained that it was graded for HDR theatrical viewing and that the brightness settings on most home televisions weren't calibrated to show it at the intended luminance level. This explanation is technically accurate and practically useless, because most people watching television are not calibrating their displays for Dolby Vision HDR content. They're watching on whatever settings their television came with, and on those settings, significant portions of the battle were nearly invisible. Beyond the visibility issue, there was a more substantive creative concern. The Night King, the primary supernatural antagonist of the entire series, built across 7 seasons as the show's ultimate existential threat, is killed in Episode 3 by Arya Stark with a single stab from her Fuchlerian steel dagger. No prolonged confrontation, no conversation, no dramatic revelation. She jumps out of the dark and stabs him, and he and his entire army shatter. I want to be careful about this, because the criticism of Arya killing the Night King sometimes slides into it should have been Jon, and that particular version of the criticism isn't especially interesting. The problem isn't who kills him. The problem is that a character who who has been developed as an almost metaphysical force, the embodiment of death, the manifestation of an ancient winter that preceded human civilization, is resolved in episode 3 of 6, in a sequence that doesn't quite reckon with what he was supposed to represent. The Night King had always worked on 2 levels. On the surface, he was a monster threatening Westeros. Below that, he was a symbol of entropy, of forgetting, of the past consuming the future. Ending him felt like it should mean something beyond just the battle being won. The episode didn't quite get there. Then came episodes 4 and 5, and the question that has generated more discussion than any other single story decision the show made: what happened to Daenerys Targaryen? Daenerys had been one of the show's 3 primary POV characters since Season 1, Episode 1. The audience had spent 7 years following her, from a frightened girl sold into a political marriage, to the breaker of chains who freed the enslaved cities of Essos, to the Dragon Queen who finally sailed for Westeros with an army and 3 dragons, and a genuine claim to the throne. Her arc had been structured as a kind of aspirational journey. She made mistakes, sometimes serious ones, but the general trajectory was upward. In Season 8, Episode 5, The Bells, Daenerys flies her dragon over a surrendered King's Landing and burns it. Not the military targets, not the Red Keep, the city, the people, thousands of civilians who have nothing to do with Cersei's rule, who are cowering in the streets as the bells ring to signal surrender. She burns them all. The story the show was trying to tell is not, in itself, unreasonable. Martin had always written Daenerys with a streak of ruthlessness beneath the Liberator's rhetoric. The phrase fire and blood is the Targaryen motto for a reason. The gradual corruption of a revolutionary who begins to believe her own mythology, who starts to see anyone who opposes her as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a person to be persuaded, is a genuinely interesting story. It's the kind of story that Martin, in the books, may eventually tell very well. The problem was the runway. The pivot from morally complicated hero to burns a city of civilians required more than 2 episodes of setup. The seeds were there: Daenerys' growing isolation, the deaths of Missandei and Rhaegal in quick succession, her estrangement from Jon, but those seeds needed seasons to grow. They got weeks, and when the moment came, it felt less like a character fulfilling her tragic potential, and more like a character doing something she'd been instructed to do so that the plot could reach its conclusion. Emilia Clarke, it should be said, gave everything she had to the material. Her performance in episodes 5 and 6 is one of the more compelling pieces of acting the show produced in its final run, working against the script's limitations rather than with them. She was handed an incomplete arc and committed to it anyway. The finale, The Iron Throne, aired May 19th, 2019. Bran Stark was elected King of the Six Kingdoms. Jon Snow was exiled. Sansa became Queen in the North. Arya sailed west. Cersei and Jaime had already died in episode 5, crushed by rubble in the Red Keep, an ending for 2 of the show's most complex characters that divided opinion fairly sharply. On Cersei and Jaime, actually, there's a reasonable argument, both for and against. The argument for: they came into the world together, they were going to leave it together. There's a tragic symmetry in dying in the ruins of the place they spent their lives fighting over. Jaime spent 2 seasons becoming a better person, and then went back to Cersei. And there's something honest about a story that acknowledges that people don't always become the better version of themselves just because the narrative has been preparing them to. Some people go back, that's true. The argument against: Cersei spent 6 seasons being the most politically intelligent operator in the story, and she died because a ceiling fell on her. 8 seasons of machinations, and it ends with structural failure. That's either profound, even the cleverest people can't outwit gravity, or it's a cop-out that the show chose because the writers didn't know how to end her properly. Probably, again, a bit of both. The Bran situation is genuinely the most debated element of the finale, and I want to give it a fair hearing because the critical dismissal of it was sometimes too quick. The idea that Bran, who is now the three-eyed raven who can perceive all of time, who is essentially a living archive of human experience, would make a good king is not inherently absurd. A ruler who can see everything that has happened and everything that is happening simultaneously would theoretically be well placed to govern wisely. Tyrion's speech about the power of stories is also not nothing. The show had always been interested in the relationship between narrative and power, in how the stories people tell about themselves shape what's possible for them. The problem again was the journey. Bran had spent 2 seasons as a largely passive presence, observing rather than participating. The transition from mystical observer to chosen king needed more preparation than the final season gave it. If you'd never heard of Bran Stark and someone described Tyrion's reasoning to you abstractly, it might sound compelling. Watching it happen to the specific character the show had presented, the quiet boy who sat in meetings and occasionally said unsettling things, it felt slightly arbitrary. The coffee cup, the water bottle. These are minor things, truly. A modern takeaway cup visible in one shot during episode 4. A plastic water bottle sitting at someone's feet in the finale. Continuity errors happen. The extraordinary thing about these particular ones is how completely they came to symbolize something larger. The feeling that the production in its final season was moving so fast that nobody was paying quite as much attention as they should have been. Whether that's fair to the crew, who by all accounts worked themselves to exhaustion, is a separate question. But the symbolic weight those 2 props acquired tells you something about the state of mind of the audience watching. There were 13.61 million live US viewers for the finale, approximately 19.3 million total across platforms, the most watched episode in HBO's history at that point. The irony of the show's biggest ever audience watching what became its most criticised episode is a sharp one. The IMDb rating for the finale, 4.0 out of 10. The lowest rated episode in the show's history by a significant margin. Season 8 as a whole averaged around 7.85 on IMDb, compared to Season 4's peak of around 9.45. The Rotten Tomatoes critic score for Season 8 was 55%, and the audience score was 30%. 4 episodes across the show's entire run received rotten ratings on RT, and 3 of those 4 were from Season 8. A Change.org petition calling for a remake of Season 8, citing the need for competent writers, gathered over 1.8 million signatures, the largest TV-related petition in the platform's history at the time. These are not the numbers of a show that slightly disappointed people. These are the numbers of a show that broke something. There's a version of the story of Game of Thrones' decline that places all of the blame on David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. They made the decisions, they wrote the episodes, they chose to condense the final act into 6 episodes when more were available. They were distracted or exhausted or more interested in Star Wars than in the work they still had to finish. That version is too simple, and I don't think it's entirely fair, but it's also not entirely wrong, and it's worth spending some time with. Benioff and Weiss were, in a very real sense, self-made showrunners. They came to Game of Thrones without prior experience running a television series, and over 8 seasons, they assembled and led one of the most complex productions in TV history. The logistics alone, multiple simultaneous filming units across Northern Ireland, Croatia, Iceland, Spain, Morocco, would have defeated most experienced producers. They did not defeat Benioff and Weiss. The case for their talent is the show's first 5 or 6 seasons. Whatever assistance they had from the source material, they made thousands of good decisions during that period. The casting, the directing hires, the decisions about what to keep and what to cut, the tone, all of those were theirs. Breaking Bad had Vince Gilligan. Game of Thrones had Benioff and Weiss. The show they made during its peak years is evidence enough of real skill. The case for the complication is this: the skills required to adapt excellent source material and the skills required to originate a compelling narrative from scratch are related but not identical. And the evidence from seasons 7 and 8 is that when Benioff and Weiss were navigating largely without Martin's roadmap, they were working in a different mode, one that didn't come as naturally. The Star Wars situation is genuinely strange to unpick. In February 2018, while Season 8 of Game of Thrones was in pre-production, Lucasfilm announced that Benioff and Weiss had been hired to develop a new series of Star Wars films. The first film was penciled in for 2022. It was framed publicly as a massive vote of confidence in them, the hottest creative team in television being handed one of the most valuable intellectual properties in entertainment. What sources later reported, through The Hollywood Reporter, Vanity Fair, and No Film School, among others, was more complicated. There were suggestions that HBO had been willing to give Benioff and Weiss as many episodes as they needed for the final act. That the network's offer was essentially, take what you need, do this properly, and that Benioff and Weiss already signed for Star Wars, already contracted for Netflix, already exhausted by 8 years of the most demanding television production in the world, declined. After the Season 8 finale aired and the backlash began, Benioff and Weiss withdrew from a scheduled farewell appearance at San Diego Comic-Con 2019. In October 2019, Lucasfilm announced that Benioff and Weiss would not be making the Star Wars trilogy after all. The official reason given was their Netflix commitments. Industry reporting suggested the parting was less entirely mutual than the press release implied, with Lucasfilm's Kathleen Kennedy said to be uncomfortable with the situation. One industry source described it as a hard quit on Benioff and Weiss's part, attributing their reluctance to the simple logic of not wanting to go through the kind of fan hostility they'd just experienced all over again. The Netflix deal was reported at $200 million. Their first significant scripted series under that deal, a series called The Chair, arrived in 2021. It was modestly well received, a fairly small-scale academic comedy drama, well acted, pleasant. Not a cultural event. The brand from the creators of Game of Thrones has not since 2019 generated the kind of enthusiasm it would have generated in 2017. The Austin Film Festival panel from 2018, before Season 8 aired, but after the Star Wars announcement, is one of the more candid moments on record from Benioff and Weiss about their own experience of making the show. In that conversation, they spoke with unusual directness about the learning curve of the early seasons. Weiss in particular talked about their first years as being characterized by a combination of ambition and genuine uncertainty, not knowing if they were capable of what they were attempting, working through problems in real time, often getting things wrong before getting them right. That candor is, I think, to their credit. They were honest about the fact that Game of Thrones made them rather than the other way around. The corollary of that honesty is what the later seasons suggest, that once the thing making them was gone, the source material, the pressure, the writer's room support, what remained was more uncertain. Two people who were extraordinarily good at one specific thing finding out in public at the end of the most scrutinized television series in the world where the limits of that thing were. None of this is to say their careers are defined by Season 8. Creative careers are long. The specific skills that made Game of Thrones work in its early years. The ability to identify what matters in source material, to assemble the right people for a complex production, to make thousands of small decisions that compound into something larger. Those are real skills. Whether they find another project that asks for exactly those skills, in circumstances that allow them to flourish, is a question that the next decade will answer more usefully than any retrospective can. None of this amounts to a comprehensive verdict on their abilities. Creative careers don't end on a single project, but the specific circumstances of Game of Thrones' final seasons, the compression, the condensed ambition, the gap between what the show was aiming for and what it achieved, are inseparable from the question of what Benioff and Weiss were bringing to it in those final years and what they were not. It would be easy, at this point in the story, to pivot entirely to George R.R. Martin and position him as the solution to the problem. If only the books had been finished. If only Martin had written the final chapters. If only the show had waited. But that framing, while tempting, isn't quite right either. So let's talk about Martin, and about the books, and about what they represent in this particular story. A Song of Ice and Fire is one of the most ambitious fantasy series ever written. Not in terms of magical systems or invented languages, though Westeros has those, but in terms of political intricacy, character psychology, and sheer narrative scope. Martin conceived it in the early 1990s as a story that could not be filmed, could not be adapted, was simply too large and too interior for any medium but prose. He was right in the sense that the adaptation required significant compromises, even at its best. The publishing history runs like this: A Game of Thrones in 1996, A Clash of Kings in 1998, A Storm of Swords in 2000, A Feast for Crows in 2005 after a lengthy delay, A Dance with Dragons in 2011. Then nothing. The Winds of Winter, the sixth book, has been announced, discussed, anticipated, and delayed repeatedly across the past 13 plus years. A Dream of Spring, the seventh and presumably final book, exists only as a title. Martin has, in various interviews and blog posts, explained the difficulty of finishing the story. The scope became larger as he wrote. The number of characters who needed resolution grew. The narrative threads that would have to be drawn together became more complex with each passing year. He's also been, during this period, extraordinarily productive in other directions. Executive producer on Game of Thrones and its successors. The author of Fire and Blood, which became House of the Dragon. Contributor to a major video game. Developer of various spin-off projects. He has not been idle. He has simply not finished the books. The show's dependence on Martin's material became clear in retrospect when Season 5 ended, and Seasons 6 through 8 revealed how different the experience of watching was when that material was absent. It's not that everything Martin wrote was automatically better than what Benioff and Weiss invented, it's that the depth of preparation behind Martin's choices, the decades of world building, the obsessive attention to consequence and character consistency provided a quality of foundation that improvisation, however skilled, couldn't fully replace. Martin gave Benioff and Weiss his outlines for the ending. The broad strokes of who lives, who dies, what the resolution is. Some of those strokes likely appear in what the show produced. The general shape of Daenerys' fate, Bran's ultimate position, the dissolution of the Iron Throne as a concept. But outlines and novels are different things. The destination might be the same. The experience of arriving there is entirely different. What makes Martin's situation genuinely unusual is that the show's ending has made his job harder rather than easier. When he eventually publishes The Winds of Winter, and I have no particular reason to doubt that he will, eventually it will be read by millions of people who have already seen a version of how the story ends. Every divergence from the show's ending will be noted and debated. Every similarity will be analysed for what it tells us about Benioff and Weiss's fidelity to his vision. The ending he writes will be judged not only on its own terms, but against the ending that aired in May 2019 and was met with 1.86 million signatures demanding a remake. That's an unusual creative position to be in, writing the ending of a story that the world already believes it knows. Martin has been characteristically thoughtful in his public comments about the show's ending. He's spoken about how his books will differ from what was on screen, how certain character arcs he's developing in prose have more room to breathe, how the ending he's writing is, in certain respects, not quite the same ending the show delivered. He's been careful not to undermine the show that made him, in commercial terms, one of the most successful fantasy authors in history, but he's also been clear in the way that careful public statements between the lines can be clear that the story, as he intends to tell it, is not entirely the story that was televised. The books, if and when they come, will offer a second path through this story. That's a strange and rather wonderful thing, actually. Most stories only get one telling. This one might get two. There's a funny kind of cultural anxiety that has built up around the Winds of Winter over the years. Let's sit with it rather than just note it in passing. Martin is not obligated to anyone's timeline. He started writing in 1991. He published 5 enormous novels over 15 years. He gave hundreds of interviews, participated in the adaptation, produced companion volumes, contributed to stage productions and video games and spin-off series. The idea that he owes the internet a book by a specific deadline is, when you put it plainly, fairly difficult to defend. And yet, the show's ending having happened before the books were finished does create a genuine strange situation, because the show in its final seasons effectively spoiled, at least in broad outline, where certain characters end up. Daenerys' fate, Bran's elevation, Jon's exile, readers who want to experience Martin's version of these events without any preconceptions about where they're heading are now navigating the cultural wreckage of Season 8. That's not Martin's fault. It's just an unusual circumstance that the particular timing of everything created. Martin has made a number of interesting statements over the years about the relationship between his books and the show, threading the needle between not undermining an adaptation he was deeply involved in producing and not falsely suggesting that the show and the books are telling identical stories. The phrase he uses most often is something like, "My books will diverge in certain ways, go to different places with certain characters, explore some things the show didn't have time to explore," which, if you read it carefully, is fairly direct about the fact that what he's writing is not the same story the television adaptation told in its final seasons. He's also mentioned, on his Not a Blog platform, that certain characters who are alive in the books but dead in the show will have further roles to play. Certain storylines that were simplified or cut for the adaptation will continue in their original form. The world he's building toward is, in other words, a fuller and in some respects different world than the one the show ultimately occupied. Whether that's reassuring or daunting probably depends on how you feel about reading a 7-book series that still isn't finished 29 years after the first volume was published. The Change.org petition that called for a Season 8 remake eventually reached about 1.86 million verified signatures over the years after the finale. Each sounds, on the surface, like a straightforwardly angry response from a disappointed audience. And it was that. But it was also something else, something slightly more interesting if you sit with it. Nobody who signed that petition genuinely expected HBO to reshoot 6 episodes of television. The logistics alone, reassembling a cast of hundreds, rebuilding or locating sets, reshooting battle sequences that had taken years to plan and execute, would be impossible even if HBO had any inclination to do it, which they emphatically did not. The petition wasn't a practical demand, it was a grief response. Game of Thrones had built, over 8 years, one of the most engaged fan communities in television history. The weekly discussion threads on Reddit, the podcasts, the detailed fan wikis, the theories and counter-theories about Jon Snow's parentage and Littlefinger's schemes and the identity of Azor Ahai, all of it had created a kind of collective, ongoing relationship with the show, an investment that went beyond simply watching it. When Season 8 ended the way it ended, that investment had nowhere to go. The machinery of engagement, the forums, the analysis videos, the discussion threads turned from enthusiasm to something more complicated. The petition was a way of expressing formally and collectively that the audience felt let down, not by a single bad episode, but by the conclusion of something they had cared about for a long time. What the backlash also surfaced, less comfortably, was a question about the relationship between audiences and the stories they love. There's a genuine tension between the criticism that Season 8 deserved, the pacing problems, the character inconsistencies, the rushed resolution of years of foreshadowing, and the somewhat more troubling idea that audiences have a right to a specific kind of ending, that a story owes its viewers satisfaction. The creative problems with Season 8 were real. The sense of ownership that informed some of the more extreme reactions was a separate thing. Both existed simultaneously, and they got tangled together in the discourse in ways that sometimes made it difficult to talk about the season honestly. The most useful thing to separate them is to say, Season 8 had documentable storytelling failures. It deserved real criticism, and separately, some of the response to it was about the grief of losing something beloved more than it was about the specific episodes. Both things are true. They're just different conversations. What the Season 8 backlash also revealed, and this is the part that gets less attention, is something about the specific relationship Game of Thrones had built with its audience over 8 years. The show had trained its viewers to invest deeply. It had rewarded close attention with revelations and callbacks that stretched back across seasons. It had asked its audience to hold an enormous amount of information in their heads and had respected them for doing so. That kind of relationship creates a particular kind of expectation. Not just that the story will be good, but that the care you put in will be met with care coming back. Season 8 broke that reciprocity, not just by being less than the show's best, that's forgivable, but by being visibly less considered. By making story choices that, on close inspection, didn't hold up to the kind of careful attention the show had spent years cultivating in its audience. The Jaime arc, Varys' abrupt execution, the speed of Daenerys' descent. These weren't failures that required effort to notice. They were visible to anyone who had been paying the kind of attention the show had asked them to pay. The cast handled it, largely, with more grace than they had to. Most of the major actors were circumspect in their public comments, expressing personal sadness at the ending of the show, gratitude for what it had given their careers, care for the fans who had supported them. A few were more direct. Emilia Clarke gave interviews in which she acknowledged that the pace of the final season was challenging to work with, that she had to search for the characters' internal logic in places where the script hadn't fully provided it. That's about as honest as any major television star can be, while the show's network is still a major industry force. The backlash eventually subsided, as backlash always does. The conversation moved on to other shows, other endings, other disappointments, and occasionally other genuine pleasures. What it left behind was a changed relationship between the audience and the franchise. Not hostile exactly, but cautious in a way it hadn't been before. The show ended in May 2019. The franchise did not. HBO's position on the Game of Thrones IP after the finale is actually more interesting than it might seem, because it represents a genuinely different philosophy from AMC's approach to The Walking Dead, which is the obvious comparison. Rather than immediately spinning off new shows from the existing characters, HBO largely stepped back, let the dust settle, and came back 3 years later with something structurally different. A story set 170 years before the events of the main series, based on Martin's published companion text, Fire and Blood, about a civil war within the Targaryen dynasty itself. House of the Dragon premiered in August 2020 and was, by most critical measures, a genuine success. The first season drew comparisons to Game of Thrones' best years. Morally complicated characters, genuine political intrigue, consequences that felt real. The show benefited from having a source text in Fire and Blood, even if that text is more of a historical chronicle than a novel. And it benefited from having showrunners, Ryan Condal for the first season, working alongside director Miguel Sapochnik, who came to it with the experience of knowing exactly what had gone wrong with their predecessor. Seasons 1 and 2 have aired. Season 3 is in production as of mid-2026. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, a very different kind of Westeros story, premiered in January 2026. Based on Martin's Dunk and Egg novellas, a series of 3 short stories set roughly 100 years before Game of Thrones, following a hedge knight named Dunk and his small squire egg. It's a considerably more intimate piece of work. Lower stakes, warmer tone, fewer dragons, more character. Early reception was generally positive, and the show seems to understand that it doesn't need to be Game of Thrones to be good. It just needs to be itself. The Jon Snow spin-off, which had been in development and was reported to involve Kit Harington, was quietly shelved in 2024. The Blood Moon pilot, which starred Naomi Watts and was set in an ancient era of Westerosi history, was not picked up after its pilot phase. Both of those cancellations are, I think, fine. Better to not make something than to make it badly. Multiple additional projects are at various stages of development. An animated series, a story focused on Aegon's conquest, an Arya-adjacent project about Nymeria and her sea voyages. HBO is plainly committed to treating Westeros as an ongoing franchise rather than a concluded universe. Whether that's creatively healthy in the long run is a question that probably requires another decade of evidence before it can be properly answered. What the existing spin-offs have demonstrated, though, and this is genuinely encouraging, is that the world Martin built is rich enough to sustain multiple kinds of stories. The failure of Game of Thrones' final season was not a verdict on Westeros. It was a verdict on those specific creative choices, in those specific circumstances. The world still works, the lore still holds, when writers who care about it approach it with enough room and enough preparation. There's still something alive in there. The broader cultural question about franchise television, whether the instinct to keep a story going indefinitely is ever creatively healthy, is one that Game of Thrones raises more sharply than most. Martin's books, with a defined endpoint of 7 volumes, have a shape. The television franchise, as HBO is developing it, is potentially infinite. House of the Dragon was planned across multiple seasons. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms has an intended 3-season arc based on the 3 Duncan Egg stories. The various projects in development, the animated series, the Nymeria story, the Aegon's conquest material, are predicated on the assumption that there is always more story to tell. There may be. Martin's world is genuinely vast, and some of its corners have barely been touched. The history of the doom of Valyria, the mysterious east of Essos, the ancient civilizations that predate everything the main story deals with. A thoughtful writer or writing team could find compelling things in any of those places. The danger isn't that the well is empty. The danger is that the commercial logic of keeping a franchise alive sometimes leads to stories being told before they're ready, in conditions that aren't quite right for them, for audiences who are already slightly fatigued. House of the Dragon has, to its credit, been making decisions that suggest its creative team is aware of this danger. The story it's telling, the Targaryen Civil War, the Dance of the Dragons, is a story with a clear trajectory, a definable beginning and end. Ryan Condal has spoken in interviews about wanting the show to feel like a complete story rather than an open-ended franchise, which is exactly the right instinct. Whether HBO's commercial interests will allow that instinct to prevail indefinitely is, of course, a separate question. In the meantime, the franchise represents Martin's work continuing to find new audiences. People who discover House of the Dragon often circle back to Game of Thrones, at least the early seasons. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms introduces Westeros to viewers who might find the scale of the main series overwhelming. The lore holds everything together, and somewhere in Santa Fe, Martin is still adding to it. There's a question that this whole story leaves behind, and it's one that I keep coming back to without quite arriving at a satisfying answer. Does a bad ending retroactively diminish everything that came before it? The honest answer, I think, is a little, but not entirely, and the distinction matters. An ending is part of a story. It colours how you remember what came before it. The Red Wedding lands differently if you know that Robb Stark's arc, for all its tragedy, was always steering toward that particular moment of consequence. The whole shape of Ned Stark's death resonates differently once you understand what kind of story it was announcing itself to be. Endings are retrospective. They tell you what everything meant. Game of Thrones' ending told a story about diminished ambition, about creative fatigue, about the difference between a show that was fighting to be great and a show that was managing to be finished. And that story does sit uncomfortably over the top of the earlier seasons when you return to them. It's not the same viewing experience to watch season 4, knowing that the people responsible for it would, 5 years later, choose to resolve 15 seasons worth of narrative stakes in 6 rushed hours. There's a slight shadow, but the work is the work, and the work was often extraordinary. Ned Stark's execution is still there. The Red Wedding is still there. Hardhome, Season 5, Episode 8, the sequence in which Jon Snow and a small group of men of the Night's Watch witness the army of the dead overrunning a wildling settlement and the Night King casually raising the newly dead as wights from across the bay, is still, for my money, 40 minutes of the most effective horror television has ever produced. Battle of the Bastards is still there. The opening sequence of The Winds of Winter season finale is still there. Those episodes exist. They're available to watch, but with small digital changes compared to how they were when they first aired. A thing that happened in Season 8 reached back and took them away. The machine that the show eventually became did not erase what the hungry, ambitious, genuinely exceptional version of the show made. What was lost was the feeling of a particular kind of Sunday night, the communal experience of a story that millions of people were following simultaneously in real time, with genuine investment. Television is, in 2026, a very different medium from what it was in 2014. The streaming era has changed the conditions under which people watch things, and the conditions under which they talk about them. The water cooler effect, the thing that made those Sunday nights feel like shared cultural events, is rarer now. Game of Thrones, in its peak years, was one of the last shows to fully inhabit that version of television. It was the last appointment drama at that scale, in that way, that we've had. The show at its best was about what people do when the world turns out to be more complicated and more painful than they expected. About the gap between who you were raised to believe you should be and who you actually have to become to survive. About love and loyalty and the cost of both in a world that doesn't reward either. Martin built those themes into the books over decades. Benioff and Weiss translated them onto screen for several extraordinary seasons with genuine fidelity. The cast, the whole of it, from Sean Bean's single season as Ned Stark through to Peter Dinklage's 8 years as Tyrion, from Emilia Clarke's Daenerys to Lena Headey's Cersei, to Kit Harington's Jon, to Maisie Williams' Arya, committed fully to material that asked an enormous amount of them. The work they did in the best seasons was exceptional by any standard. It deserves to be remembered on its own terms. In May 2019, Game of Thrones ended with 19.3 million people watching. The Iron Throne was melted down by the last surviving dragon. The Great Council of Westeros elected Bran Stark king with the logic, Tyrion's logic, that stories matter, and that Bran has the most interesting story, which is either a beautiful, self-aware conclusion to a show that had always been, fundamentally, about the power of narrative, or a slightly pat justification for a choice that the story's own internal logic hadn't fully supported, probably a bit of both. Jon Snow walked north, the wildlings walked with him. Winter had already been, summer was coming eventually. What lingers, I think, is not the ending specifically. It's the specific feeling of watching something at its best. That particular quality of engagement that the show produced during its peak years, when the combination of source material and committed production and genuine craft all aligned simultaneously. That alignment is rare in any medium. Television, with its industrial demands, the episode orders, the network relationships, the production schedules, the budget negotiations, makes it rarer still. The show was extraordinary for long enough that its eventual decline is genuinely painful. If it had been mediocre from the start, there would be nothing to mourn. The height of the fall is a function of the height of the climb. You can't have one without the other. I find myself thinking, occasionally, about the Hardhome sequence, Season 5, Episode 8. Jon Snow and Tormund lead a group of men of the Night's Watch to a wildling settlement north of the Wall to try to evacuate the surviving wildlings before the army of the dead arrives. The arrival is delayed and delayed and delayed, and then all at once it isn't anymore. The dead come over the cliff in a wave that is, simply, one of the most terrifying things television had produced up to that point. And then the Night King walks to the end of a pier and looks at Jon Snow across the water. Jon looks back. They hold each other's gaze for a moment. And then the Night King raises his arms, and every wildling who has just died rises behind him. Jon, on a boat pulling away from the dock, watches this happening and can do nothing. That shot, Jon's face, the helplessness on it, the weight of understanding in it, is the show at its most uncompromising. It's saying, this is what you're dealing with. This is the scale of the thing. And there's nothing you can do about it right now, except leave and try to find a way. It's a great piece of television. Simple, direct, devastating, and it exists permanently, exactly as it was when it aired. Nothing that came after, in seasons 7 or 8, not even the somewhat anticlimactic resolution of the Night King story, reaches back and diminishes what that sequence was. That's just not how art works. The good things stay good. The work is the work. There will probably be another show at some point that does what Game of Thrones did at its peak, that creates the specific experience of a shared cultural event unfolding in real time, that asks its audience to invest deeply and rewards that investment with genuine surprise and genuine consequence. Television keeps finding new ways to do things that seem impossible until someone does them. Game of Thrones seemed impossible in 2009. It happened anyway. Until then, the early seasons are there, the Red Wedding is there, Hardhome is there, The Winds of Winter, the season 6 finale, not the unpublished novel, is there. A story that was, for several years, one of the finest things the medium produced. A story that found, in the wreckage of a civilization, something worth saying about what people owe each other and what they sacrifice and what they build and what they lose. That's still there. It always will be. The show that ended in 2019 and the franchise that continues in 2026 are the complicated parts. The show that ran from 2011 to roughly 2019 was something else. Something that doesn't come along very often. And that, honestly, is enough. One last thing, and then I'll leave you to it. The show's title, Game of Thrones, shares its name with the first novel in George R.R. Martin's series, and is echoed in a line Cersei Lannister says to Eddard Stark in the 7th episode of the first season, "When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die." Story about power, and about what power costs, and about the specific willingness to pay that cost or refuse to pay it. The Iron Throne itself, that singular object around which the entire political history of Westeros revolves, is made from the swords of Aegon the Conqueror's enemies, melted together. It is, famously, uncomfortable. It cuts. Sitting on it requires a particular kind of active tolerance for pain, which is either an enormous metaphor for what governing actually requires, or just a good reason to commission better furniture. Martin clearly intended the former. The throne as emblem of a system that rewards the willingness to endure what others won't. That image stayed consistent across the whole run. Even in the final season's messier moments, the physical Iron Throne remained what it had always been, the show's central symbol, the thing people died for and compromised themselves for, and lost everything trying to reach. Its eventual destruction in the finale by the last surviving dragon who had found his rider dead is the most visually coherent moment in the episode. Of everything that had been built around that throne, all the competing claims and alliances and betrayals gone in dragonfire, history ending. something new beginning. Whether what came after it was worth the cost is the question the story kept asking and never quite answered to everyone's satisfaction. But then, most honest stories don't. And somewhere in the world, probably in his study in Santa Fe, George R.R. Martin is still writing. The winds of winter will arrive when it arrives. A dream of spring will follow if all goes as it should. The story, as he intends to tell it, the one he's been living with since 1991, the one that grew too large for cinema and too expensive for television, and found eventually a home that it half outgrew, that story has not been finished yet. When it is, it might offer something that the television series, for all its heights and all its stumbles, couldn't quite provide. An ending that was chosen by the person who knew, better than anyone, what the story was actually for. Until then, there's always Season 4.